Wherever you are joining us from today, welcome to CyberCube's latest global threat briefing, our biannual update on the cyber threat landscape. I'm Yvette Essen, Head of Content, Communications and Creative at CyberCube, and I'm excited to be here in London to highlight some of the findings from some pretty comprehensive research. Our team has sieved through months' worth of data and intelligence to highlight areas for the insurance and reinsurance community to focus on. During the next 60 minutes, we will be covering a broad range of topics. These include an examination of criminal and nation-state activity, an update on the latest ransomware trends, a review of recent attacks and some of the lessons learned, plus CyberCube's insight into what to expect in the second half of 2023. William Altman, Cyber Threat Intelligence Principal, is joining us from New York to share these insights over the next 40 minutes in a presentation. Thanks to everyone who has already submitted questions in advance. There will be plenty of opportunity at the end of the presentation to ask any additional questions, so please do type them into the Q&A box throughout the webinar. Now, William, before you delve into the detail, could you please just give a brief overview of what our global threat briefing is and how it has been created?
Absolutely. Thank you, Yvette. And thanks to everyone who's joining us today for the H2 2023 Global Threat Briefing. This is a briefing that we prepare as part of our CyberCube concierge service. This is a threat intelligence service that we have built specifically to serve the broking, cyber insurance, and cyber reinsurance market. So really nothing like it exists in the world today. A lot of threat intelligence companies are out there, but none of them are tailoring their deliverables specific to insurance use cases. And this report is just one of those deliverables that comes as part of this concierge service that we provide here at CyberCube. So you'll see today some of CyberCube's perspective on the threat landscape. What do we deem important? How do different cyber threat activities make their way into our modeled assumptions, our signals, and more? And lots of really great stuff in this report. I'm just so happy that everyone's here to listen. And again, like Yvette said, we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. So feel free to get all your thoughts out there, and we should just have a really great conversation today. Really excited to dive in.
Great. Well, thanks very much for that very brief overview of what today is about, this global threat briefing presentation. Just to let the audience know, this is a presentation we're going to go through. It's a briefer presentation than what is sent out to our concierge clients. This will become the basis of a more in-depth report that will be sent out going forward in the next few weeks or so. But let's focus on that presentation now. So William, over to you.
Thank you, Yvette. So as Yvette said, we're CyberCube. We provide end-to-end cyber analytics, and our platform serves really the insurance industry with an unrivaled ecosystem of data, signals, and models to fuel our bread and butter, which is cyber risk quantification. All of the data that you see in this report today is coming from our product suite, from our portfolio manager solution to help CyberCube's risk managers and reinsurance clients manage cyber aggregation risk across the portfolio, as well as Account Manager, our single risk underwriting solutions. Really that single risk product that's purpose-built by underwriters for underwriters. And we believe here at CyberCube that cyber insurers that are equipped with relevant cyber threat intelligence are poised to anticipate rising threats and to adapt accordingly, and chief among all goals, to prevent losses. And so that is the spirit of this report and what we bring to you. We're going to take a quick look at the cyber insurance market from a threat perspective today. We're going to look at different industries and how they stack up against one another in terms of their relative cyber risk. We'll also take a look at nation-state cyber threat activity, a topic that's really on everyone's mind today in this industry. We'll talk a little bit about war exclusions as well. I know we've already gotten some questions on the topic, so expect that we'll get into that a bit today. We're definitely going to look at cyber criminal trends as well, as these threat actors are responsible for the majority of losses that we see today. We'll do a little bit of a deep dive on ransomware trends. What have we seen in Q1 2023 and where we headed? Finally, we'll finish up with our last two sections, recent cyber attacks that have occurred since the start of the year that really shed light on the potential for these events to turn into cyber catastrophes. We'll also link some of these real-world events to CyberCube's portfolio manager scenario catalog. Finally, you'll get to hear our 2023, H2 2023 threat outlook. What are some of the things we're paying attention to and watching towards the end of this year that we want you to know about as well? So without further ado, let's jump right in. It's pretty clear today that the market is showing signs or early signs of stabilization with premiums beginning to settle. Increases for cyber insurance slowed in Q1 23. The average increase was about 8.4% in Q1 this year, compared to 15% in the previous quarter and over 20% a year ago. So we really see the efforts of carriers in particular focusing on insureds improvements in basic cyber risk management, things like multi-factor authentication, and generally just ensuring good cyber hygiene over time. We even see carriers refusing to outright provide or quote accounts that have inadequate cybersecurity. And at the same time, we know that brokers are taking a more proactive approach, educating clients on cyber risk preparedness, and really everyone is requesting more information during renewals. And we see that here reflected, I think, in the premium price as this market starts to get a handle on the risk by using products like CyberCube. But we still see quite a bit of attacks. That being said, we see professional services as really being in the crosshairs in Q1 2023. This is some data coming from our partners at Kroll. Kroll is one of the largest incident response companies in the world, and they see thousands of incidents every year. So we're looking at a share of incidents by Kroll's overall IR cases, the share of incidents classified as by each industry. So we can see threat actors favored that professional services sector a lot in Q1 2023. Kroll actually identified an ongoing search engine optimization poisoning campaign by the Bootloader malware. So this tactic was also observed in late 2022, and primarily today we see small and medium-sized law firms getting attacked by this method. Lots of drive-by downloads, basically convincing lawyers to download templates that are laden with malware. So a threat that we're watching closely this year. And every year on this briefing or every quarter, we try to call out different industries that we're watching through the latter half of the year. So in the previous threat briefing, it was healthcare, and this year it's professional services. What we're looking at here is CyberCube's security score. The security score is our way of measuring a single company's cyber hygiene and cyber preparedness, and essentially looking at the extent to which they effectively invest in satisfying the fundamental elements of the NIST cybersecurity framework. That is the cyber hygiene framework laid out by the National Institute of Standards and Technology. So a pretty authoritative score. We can then aggregate that score amongst companies and different industries and by sizes. So what we're looking at here is a representation of all companies in the US that have cyber insurance that are medium-sized. And we can see that amongst medium-sized companies in the US, professional services is among the least secure. So these companies are struggling to satisfy those core elements of the NIST cybersecurity framework. And for that reason, they are also underprepared in the face of their inherent exposure and in light of increased targeting by threat actors. So we expect more attacks in this sector in H2 2023. CyberCube also has what's called an exposure score. This is where we're measuring the flip side of that cybersecurity coin, looking at everything that a company really has inherent about itself and its operations and the data it holds that makes it an attractive target for cyber threat actors. The idea is that companies that are highly inherently exposed to cyber threats should also have security in line with that exposure to protect themselves in the face of that inherent exposure. When we put the security score and exposure score on a matrix, as you can see on your screen, we can see that the upper right quadrant, we get the highest risk companies, highest risk risk industries. These are going to be those industries that are highly exposed, attractive targets for threat actors, but also undersecured relative to that threat. We see healthcare, professional services. Banking is almost high risk, but more moderate, given that it has better security and better regulations around this stuff. Retail tends to be more moderate risk. Aviation, highly exposed, but very secure. Whereas when we look at mining and agriculture, we see some more opportunity zones, some areas that are more secured than others, but also far less exposed. These analyses are made possible by CyberCube's U.S. cyber exposure databases, what we call the IED and EED. Reinsurers can use these databases to understand cyber risk from a couple different angles, essentially model-ready data that they can use across different workflows like benchmarking company exposures, assessing real-time losses to cyber incidents, validating models, creating industry loss curves, pro forma portfolios, and a lot more. So these are very powerful representations of the current cyber insurance market today. And the analysis we saw is just one possible way to look at the market. Now let's dive into our nation state level threat activity update. CyberCube follows an array of nation state cyber threat activities. We look all over the world for indications of cyber threat activity linked to nation states. We try to understand who these threat actors are, what they're up to, what their motivations and capabilities are. And when we really boil it down, we're tracking 4 threat actors primarily, and we're even looking closer at their specific regional conflicts. We monitor these regional conflicts, or what we call hot zones, because they provide insight into potential cyber reinsurance impacts of future cyber wars. So these nation-state cyber hot zones include Russia, Ukraine, China, Taiwan, Iran and Israel, and North Korea and South Korea, in addition to these threat actors' global activities. We specifically monitor these hot zones, though, because they are going to show us indications that the boundaries of acceptable behavior in cyberspace have been pushed past historic precedent or norms, and evidence of cyber attacks bridging the divide from digital to physical impacts in these areas are especially notable. So that being said, let's dive into the Russia-Ukraine conflict and some cyber insights around this conflict. We won't have time on this briefing to cover the totality of the war and an update on what's happening, or even all the cyber activity that has taken place. But what we see here is that CrowdStrike has identified Russian activities in the war, including intelligence gathering, information operations that influence public opinion, and destructive malware attacks that we'll focus on today. The figure below really provides an overview of Russia's activities. The start of the war in Q1 22 was really marked by a high volume of attacks, including unprecedented destructive malware attacks. There was actually more destructive malware used in Q1 22 than in the previous 8 years combined as a result of this threat actor and this conflict. These destructive tactics, as you can see here, marked by this red bulge in Q4 2022, really made a comeback, and they have persisted throughout the first quarter of this year. And we expect that activity to continue on the battlefield as Russia becomes more desperate and in need of ways to destroy things without actually sacrificing human life, because they've proven that they're going to run low of that resource if they continue on their current path. So what we see here is an increase and a renewed increase in destructive attacks over the intel and information operations that we've previously seen. So this is activity that we think is likely to continue. And for that reason, we're prompting our reinsurance customers to model destructive malware disasters in light of the activity we're seeing as a result of Russia's war in Ukraine. So what we see here are CyberCube's portfolio manager solution scenarios for destructive malware and catastrophic attacks. This includes the targeted use of destructive malware against cloud services providers that causes widespread outages and impacts for cloud customers. It also includes attacks on endpoint and server operating systems globally. Notably, CyberCube customers can actually model the impacts of widespread destructive malware attacks that occur against server and endpoint operating systems simultaneously, which we think is a more reasonable way to model that than if those two were apart. What you're also seeing here is that CyberCube has what's called an event families approach to our scenario catalog. This is really going to make the model easier to work with, especially for new users. It makes the outputs easier to interpret and understand, and this also benefits everyone, even sophisticated users. The scenario family classes really help educate people. The impact type generally matters the most when modeling these attacks, whereas the specific kill chains, when comparing it to the real world, may not matter as much. So the event families are really there to simplify and make the model easier to understand and easier to use and easier to compare to real world events. So you'll see that event family classification off to the left as we go through. Now let's move to China and Taiwan. No secret that China is a threat actor that's very active across the world stage. China Nexus adversaries targeted Taiwanese tech organizations in 2022. They really aligned this mission with their economic espionage and technological dominance goals. And these adversaries really targeted various industries and regions throughout the world. In June 2023, actually, a Chinese state-sponsored group called Volt Typhoon infiltrated critical U.S. Critical infrastructure. And it's widely believed that these threat actors are intending to disrupt critical internet and communications backbones in the event that there was an invasion of Taiwan and the US would jump in to assist. So we see that telecommunications and internet backbone infrastructure are clearly in the crosshairs today, especially US infrastructure in light of our allegiance or alliance with Taiwan. So we're prompting our reinsurance customers today to model these internet and communications single point of failure disasters. So attacks that occur on cloud infrastructure, cloud software, and network services. Things like attacks on leading DNS providers, leading mobile network operators, internet service providers, and more. So you can clearly see how the cascading impacts of one of those technologies going down would have catastrophic impact, and the losses from those events could be modeled with these scenarios. Next up, we're looking at Iran and Israel. I think it's no secret here that Iran is primarily targeting adversaries regionally with a focus on Israel. They also target the UAE and Saudi Arabia and others, but the US really comes in second. What we're primarily observing in the conflict between Iran and Israel today are attacks on operational technology. This is technology that specifically controls the physical operations of machinery, often in critical infrastructure, manufacturing, and heavy industry environments. So we saw in early April that Iranian-linked threat actors targeted water controllers of at least 10 Israeli farms and replacing images on their programmable logic controllers with the message "down with Israel." So we see here, this is an attack on critical infrastructure. It's water necessary for human life, farming. It's an attack on the food supply chain, and it directly targeted the operational technology that enables the functioning of that farming machinery. These are the types of attacks that we see occurring more and more, and we think the potential for physical impact is escalating in this particular conflict more than anywhere else on Earth today. For that reason, we're prompting our customers to model operational technology SPOF disasters. So you can see these are all categorized in the physical damage impact family, and they are related to things like attacks on oil rigs, aircraft weaponization, destructive malware against maritime vessels that causes them to capsize, and much more. So we have here a selection of those OT technology disasters to model. Finally, we're looking at North Korea and South Korea. This conflict is primarily characterized by the North Koreans attacking government targets for espionage purposes and then targeting money systems to fund the regime in light of sanctions. This is primarily today taking the form of attacks on cryptocurrency exchanges. interestingly enough, there's some hotly anticipated cryptocurrency regulations on the horizon that could make it more difficult for threat actors to conceal their identities at exchanges and to launder their proceeds from these illicit activities. So we think, and this is still a hypothesis, but we think that in light of these regulations, if they were to come into force, North Korea in particular is likely to reorient its cyber threat activity away from crypto and back towards the traditional money system. And so we're looking at different SPOF disasters today that include money system SPOF. So we have here attacks on leading financial transaction providers like the SWIFT banking system. This is a target that the North Koreans have actually breached and attacked successfully in the past. We see also a number of attacks on leading outsourced payroll providers, mobile point of sale providers, even e-commerce platforms, and more. So all those types of money system disasters are where we think the North Korean cyber threat might be headed in the future. Cyber criminal threat activity update. Let's jump into what the criminals are doing. Now, before we do this, it's worth noting that the nation states and the criminals are working closely together, that there's a spectrum of state sponsorship at play for all the criminal gangs we're going to talk about. For the purposes of our discussion, we'll separate them into two groups, but it's not as clear cut as that in the real world. And I'm happy to talk more about that if it's interesting for the group. Just go ahead and ask that in the questions. So no secret today that ransomware is the threat on everyone's mind. It is really the biggest driver of losses in the cyber insurance market today, and it is not going away. In fact, it's actually getting worse. We saw a surge in May 2023, new monthly records set, and we've seen that the volume of attacks is not abating. This is due to the fact that there are more threat actors than ever attempting to exploit companies by encrypting, stealing, and extorting their data. And we also see that the threat itself has proliferated globally, that there's now, it's still largely a US problem, but there are ransomware attacks occurring every day in almost every country on earth for which there's a specific level of digitization at play. So we see that this is now a global phenomenon and it's not going away. In light of that, we are still prompting all of our clients to do deep dives on the accounts that warrant it for ransomware signals specifically. So we have things like ransomware toolkits, known ransomware infections, ransomware vulnerabilities, and common entry vectors for ransomware threat actors, like the existence of an open RDP port. All of this and more is possible to detect on a company's network using CyberCube's account manager platform. We can also use these signals across a portfolio, and we can determine which companies in a portfolio have the most ransomware susceptibility relative to others. One of the more interesting data points on ransomware and the progress that defenders are making is the share of ransomware incidents that result in payments made to the threat actors. So what we see here are ransomware attacks that resulted in those payments to the threat actor as a form of resolution to the attack, as a share of Coveware incident response cases stretching back to Q1 2019 and through the first quarter of this year. You can see that since Q1 2019, the share of incidents that resulted in a payment actually went down. This is good. This is progress. This is defenders denying threat actors the ability to fund future activities. Now you see here in Q1 23 that 45% of those incidents resulted in a ransom paid. This is the first time that we've actually seen an uptick in that number since the previous 4 consecutive quarters. So what's happening here? Why are more companies choosing to pay this ransom? Pretty simple. If you look at the average and medium-sized ransom payment amounts being demanded by threat actors today, you can see here on this chart on the left that as of Q4 2022, they brought the payment amount down. So the price is coming down, more companies are deciding to pay. That being said, threat actors are also hitting really big companies today. This is a stark difference from Q2 2022 and what we saw after the Colonial Pipeline attack. If you recall, a ransomware gang took down US critical energy infrastructure, and subsequently the FBI went out and shut them down. So threat actors were afraid of these reprisals by US law enforcement. And for a while, they really only hit small and medium-sized companies that warranted the payout, but didn't actually warrant that higher level of attention from law enforcement. Today, as a result, largely of the war in Ukraine, Russian threat actors in particular no longer fear extradition or reprisals by US law enforcement. They are already in the crosshairs of US law enforcement. Why not go after the biggest possible targets? And you can see that evidence here in the medium-sized companies impacted through Q1 2023. The size of companies continues to go up. So we think it's never been a more important time for underwriters to estimate the cost of ransomware on the accounts that they write. This is really where CyberCube shines. We can not only tell you the individual cyber risks detected on a company's network, but we can quantify those results and tell you what that means for your terms and conditions. We can provide a loss ratio for you and help you decide where to attach on the tower, given the losses a company might experience in light of various threats. So let's take a little deep dive on who is behind this threat activity. Really no secret that Lockbit is the most active ransomware gang of all time, and really, interestingly, the last true ransomware as a service operation standing today. We see that a lot of ransomware as a service gangs, this is the business model where ransomware operators provision code to affiliates, much like a franchise fast food model or a software as a service company that provisions normal software. So it's called RAS. And these groups flourished for a long time. And then due to some internal strife like leaks, law enforcement activity, and more, there's been some restructuring amongst these groups, and they've now banded together. At least some of them have banded together under the Lockbit moniker, making Lockbit the most frequent and severe ransomware gang on the planet today. You can see that the number of victims worldwide on Lockbit leak sites is quite high. There was a little dip there in Q4 2022. I'm not exactly sure what that's from, but it is worth noting that these are number of victims posted on the Lockbit leak site, and not all of Lockbit's victims get posted there. You only get posted there if you don't pay the ransom. So Q4 2022 may be a result of more more victims paying the ransom to Lockbit and not actually having their data exposed. So when it comes to Lockbit specifically, CyberCube can do a couple things to help our clients. First and foremost, we're prompting our portfolio manager customers to go in and look for companies in their portfolios that have high degrees of susceptibility to being attacked by Lockbit. So we know that Lockbit attacks manufacturing, healthcare, services companies that tend to be medium, large size in the US that have various security issues already present on their network, namely exposed credentials on the deep and dark web that Lockbit affiliates can purchase for access, as well as known ransomware vulnerabilities and software vulnerabilities. So these are just an example of some of the signals that we can detect. You can expand this analysis and look at the types of signals Lockbit exploits, the types of technologies they exploit that companies in the portfolio are reliant on, and more, all to try and triangulate those companies in a portfolio that may be most susceptible to this type of threat activity. When it comes to threat actors that are emerging and coming online that we need to worry about beyond Lockbit, no surprise, the Clop gang is here. If you've been following cybersecurity in the news lately, you know that this gang is responsible for one of the worst widespread data breach events in recent memory. They hit about 130 companies, over 16 million individuals saw their data exposed. This is all happening within the last month. So clearly, Clop's victim count for June 2023 would go up. We actually were surprised here when we looked at some data from Kroll and Intel 471 that showed Clop actually overtook Lockbit in June. So we're prompting our clients to go in and do a similar analysis and look for Clop targets in their portfolios. We can do this today through the UI, looking just at firmographic and security signals and paring down a portfolio, looking for those different indicators. And we can also do a much deeper analysis today called portfolio threat actor intelligence. And if you're interested in that, please get in touch with us. That's part of our concierge service. One other note that CyberCube is providing to our clients here, we can also look for victims of the Lockbit or of the Clop gang and the MoveIt breach that may be in your portfolio. So CyberCube and our partners are actively monitoring dark web leak sites, specifically extortion websites on the dark web, and we monitor the Clop leak sites, and we can query that data for company names that might be in your portfolio. So we're not only able to look at indications that companies may be attacked by Clop in the future, but we're also able to identify if they've already been attacked by Clop. So if you're interested in this analysis, again, please get in touch with us. Today, we're also looking at managed file transfer tools that Clop is really known to hit and target. And we're looking at the next batch of those that they might target and looking at companies and portfolios that are reliant on those specific technologies and trying to warn some of our clients about that activity. So let's turn to our recent attacks and lessons learned. We start here with an attack on SD-Works in April 2023. It's a Belgian HR and payroll company that was forced to shut down some of its operations after detecting malicious activity on those systems. The company services about 82,000 other companies and delivers payroll and HR services to 5.2 million people. So this is a very large company, very big single point of failure. We learned that these are attractive targets for threat actors due to the sensitive data that they hold, as well as the critical nature of their services. It's time critical. People need their payments on time. Companies that don't have adequate visibility over their networks will be more likely to proactively shut them down in order to stop attacks that they don't know where those attacks are spreading. That was probably the case in this attack. It's fortunate, this company is fortunate it detected this activity early, and it really shines a light on the importance of EDR and SIM technologies and how important those are in defense and recovery. CyberCube has a scenario in our catalog that can help our clients model the impacts of an attack like this. It's a scenario in which cyber criminals gain access to data in a leading payroll and human resources management provider network. CyberCube models a very similar attack in which PII and financial data of employees is stolen. And suspension of operations also occurs, as did in the SD-Works attack. The modeled results for this attack include things like business interruption, incident response costs, customer notifications, credit monitoring, public relations costs, and even legal liabilities. So quite comprehensive and a really solid match for our scenario catalog to the real world. And then now we'll talk a little bit more about MoveIt, just because this is probably the biggest attack to occur since the start of the year. Really woke up the insurance industry, I think, to the use of managed file transfer tools and how those are now single points of failure that are increasingly targeted by threat actors. CyberCube actually identified approximately 3,000 internet-exposed MoveIt deployments in June 2023. We did this through our SPOF intelligence tool, and then we equipped our clients with the ability to query that list so they could determine if their insureds were, in fact, using vulnerable MoveIt deployments. And then we also know that hidden supply chain vulnerabilities are a real blind spot for our industry today. That you could have a flock of companies that you insure and you're positive that they all have really great really great security, but maybe a couple of them share data with a third party that then uses MoveIt. And if that third party's MoveIt instance is breached, your insured's data is also breached. And that today is somewhat of a blind spot for the industry that CyberCube is working on. We're coming up with some really novel ways to potentially address that risk in light of the MoveIt breach. So what we see here is CyberCube's security incident report as part of our concierge service that we provided to our clients first on June 6th and then again at the end of the month to really give them a sense of what was happening in real time when it came to the MoveIt breach. So things like the timeline of the attack, disclosed victims, and then how to use CyberCube's products and services to identify victims. So you see here the redacted heat map of our global MOVE-IT dependency mapping. And our scenario to match up to the MOVE-IT event is scenario 21. Not an exact match, but we do model ransomware and extortion costs across a portfolio of companies. So very similar impacts, although a different kill chain. So we'll finish up here today by looking at CyberCube's H2 2023 threat outlook. This is just a bit of what we're watching throughout the end of the year that we think is going to be really interesting for this industry to follow. So we should expect nation-state cyber threat activity to really push the boundaries of war exclusion language. While there's been substantial progress in momentum in including cyber war exclusion policies, the reinsurance market is yet to settle on a consistent approach that's really acceptable to all stakeholders. The approaches that are being taken have high levels of uncertainty due to the nature of cyber attribution in particular and limited historic precedent. None of these events have really happened. So consistency and clarity is going to really help increase confidence that the cyber reinsurance market is both protected from some of the extreme tail events and also reaffirm the value of cyber insurance products as a whole. So given the nature of systemic losses and geopolitical events today, governments in particular are going to have a vested interest in the market's direction, specifically as it relates to cyber war exclusion language. We expect all this to play out, at least initially, over the next 6 months. We also expect that threat actors, and in particular the criminal threat actors, are going to rely less on data encryption and more on data exfiltration and more on data exfiltration and resale and less on encryption and extortion. So what we've seen is that threat actors previously would encrypt data on the network and demand a ransom for decryption. Companies got better at backup and recovery, and that was no longer a viable option for the threat actors. They then resorted to stealing data and threatening to release that data if a payment wasn't made, an extortion attack. Now it's widely known that threat actors do not honor those contracts, and if you pay to not have your data resold or disclosed, in most cases, or in many cases, in fact, that data is still resold or exposed. And so we're seeing that a lot of organizations just refuse to even engage with the threat actors in an extortion attack, and they consider their data already gone. That is now impacting the threat actors' ability to monetize those types of attacks. And we're going to experience a bit of a lull here in the encryption and extortion part of these schemes. And I think we're going to see a return to traditional data theft and resale, where threat actors are stealing data that's lucrative on the dark web, healthcare data and financial information mostly. A lot of access to PayPal accounts and things like that. And then finally, we should expect more attacks on core internet assets and cloud infrastructure, including destructive, financial, and even hacktivist attacks. When it comes to those destructive attacks, I really look at some incidents that occurred related to Russia and the leaking of classified information in Russia, what were known as the Vulcan files. These files relate to a cybersecurity company in Russia that makes different tooling on behalf of the GRU and groups that are like Sandworm and others. These files were found to contain maps of the United States, in which there were maps that could be significant internet servers and user-based populations. So we know that the Russian government and other threat actors are targeting these internet backbone technologies. We also see that there's been a twofold increase in attacks on critical cloud infrastructure by financially motivated threat actors. Specifically, VMware assets and hypervisors are under attack. And then finally, we also saw recently that a hacktivist group loosely linked to the Russian state. I would consider them to be Russian threat actors, but not state sponsored necessarily. They brought down Microsoft's Azure and Outlook cloud services with a DDoS attack. This group was called Anonymous Sudan. So we're looking at a future in which nation states target internet backbone infrastructure in destructive attacks. Criminals target critical cloud infrastructure in financial attacks, and hacktivist organizations are willing and capable to bring down the world's largest cloud services providers. So we are looking at a situation where maybe cyber aggregation risk modeling might have been a fun academic pastime in years past. Today, it's a very real mandate on behalf of the insurance community, and the threat activity is really underscoring that this needs to be done. And CyberCube is really pleased to be here to help the market adapt in the face of all these different threats. So I want to thank everyone for sitting through our global threat briefing today, and I welcome any and all questions or comments.
Great. Thank you very much, William, for that presentation. Thankfully, you are welcoming questions. We have got so many questions coming in. Please do continue to send them through. I'll try to get through as many as possible in the next 15 minutes or so. I'm afraid if we don't have time to get to your question, we will try and answer and email them back as well. But William, before you close your presentation, I'm going to ask you to turn to slide 10 to address one of these questions. So this question actually starts with a thank you. So if you go to slide 10, and it's someone has written, "Thank you, William, for your comprehensive presentation." Now, on slide 10, you mentioned different sizes of business, such as mid-size. Questions here. How does CyberCube categorize small, medium enterprise businesses? Is it by like a specific annual revenue? And what sort of general themes are we seeing?
Yeah, so we do classify companies by revenue when it comes to size. I don't want to get these numbers wrong, but I think a micro company is 0 to 10 million. A small is 10 million to 100, and then a medium is 100 to 250. Those could be off. CyberCube maintains really strict rules on the size of company and their buckets for their sizes. So we definitely see that, size ranges vary in terms of security. When you see large companies, they tend to be more secure, but also more exposed to cyber threats. And when you see micro or small companies, they tend to be a lot less exposed inherently, but tend to be a little lower undersecured. They have more resource constraints and a lot less ability to buy one of everything or spend money on a lot of different resources for cybersecurity. When you look here at this particular chart, you can see in the high security category, aviation, public, oil, gas, marine, energy utilities, banking. Those are all highly regulated industries, especially the public sector. You've got groups like the FBI and CISA that can actually go into those networks and make changes and defend those networks more proactively. And so you see that they're highly secure. Aviation, I think, has just taken cybersecurity seriously for a really long time, given the zero tolerance for failure that they have in that industry. So I hope that answers your question. We could probably get you some more specific numbers on the size buckets, but if you have further questions, keep them coming.
Great, plenty more questions to keep on coming. Now, this is a question that was sent in advance of the webinar, so thanks to people who submitted them in advance. What are CyberCube's observations of the war exclusion situation in the market?
Well, CyberCube is more of a neutral player on this particular topic. We are not here to advise on specific policy language, but we do have a lot of observations given that we work with the largest cyber insurance and reinsurance and broking companies in the world, and we do talk to them about this subject a lot. And so CyberCube's general stance is that today, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of confusion around war exclusions. A lot of the language is not consistent. I think there's been some over-reliance on things like attribution or geographic and time restrictions that need to be met in order for the clauses to apply or not apply. I think a lot of those things were created in a vacuum by lawyers in a room and not by cyber experts or anyone that has tracked catastrophic cyber risk over time. I think that's changed changing today. We now have a lot of people in these companies, in AIG, in Beasley, at Lloyd's, that are familiar with catastrophic cyber risk. They've been studying this problem since as far back as NotPetya or even before, and they have a more comprehensive understanding of how these events may or may not unfold. They've also been working with partners like CyberCube now for over 7 years, trying to figure out what these events could cost. And the combination, I think, of those two things is creating an environment in which the language and the policies around war exclusions are poised to get a lot better in the near future. And that's really our stance today. We can also help clients model different war exclusion perspectives. So we can look at our scenario catalog for the types of scenarios that would be staged by either a highly advanced criminal threat actor linked to a nation state or a nation state threat actor, and the events that would likely be attributed to war. And we can look at how war exclusions might apply across the portfolio in the event of those disasters. So we can see high levels of exclusions applying, medium levels of exclusions applying, or what would happen in the event of a disaster if none of your exclusions applied. And we can map out the costs of those different scenarios and help you develop your own perspective on the war exclusion conundrum.
Great, thank you. Moving on topics, one thing you did mention in your prediction section at the end, William, we talked about data exfiltration, and we've got some questions on that, so I'll just pick one here for now. What does the recent trend towards data exfiltration without encryption in ransom attacks mean from an insurance perspective?
Yeah, certainly. So I think when we look at the losses from an extortion attack, we're looking at all the traditional data breach issues, especially if it's unencrypted PII or PHI data. There's a need to let regulators know of these things, to message to your employees if their data is taken, to your customers in an appropriate time in line with regulations. That all costs money. That's all separate from the initial event triage, mitigation, kicking the threat actors out of your system, potentially having to shut down your system in order to eradicate them. These things are all costs that are going to occur. And I think today, like I said, we're seeing a lot less success on the extortion side for the threat actors. So I do anticipate that will change, and we're going to see more data theft and resale. And so the costs associated with that, everything I just talked about, but then you have this added element of data resale, and the types of data that are being resold are traditionally financial information that can be used for fraud. So you have to tack on identity and fraud monitoring services for your victims onto any costs potentially. So there's some additional costs, but in some ways, it's getting better right now, because I still think the worst times were when threat actors could just lock up all your data and threaten to keep it locked up unless you paid a ransom. Companies were really beholden to the threat actors back then, and they would pay a very high ransom in return. And insurance companies were on the hook for a lot of other costs like business interruption, contingent business interruption, the ransomware amount itself. Today, we're just seeing that the threat actors have less leverage. Now, if I were a betting man, I would say it's only a matter of time before they innovate and come up with a new way to monetize their schemes. And today, it's this just a lull that we're experiencing when it comes to data theft and resale.
Great, thank you. William, moving on, another question here is on Move It. We're getting a few questions here on Move It, which you did focus on, but there's one here in particular. Given similarities with Excellion, why do you think the industry wasn't more prepared for Move It?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's a really good question. I think the reason is because the threat actors, the CLOP threat actors, were not nearly as successful in monetizing their attacks from Forta's Go Anywhere software and then the Excellion breach. There were some high profile victims from Excellion. I think like the government of Toronto and others were hit. But ultimately, the threat actors didn't make as much money from this attack as they thought, because a lot of the victims, again, refused to pay an extortion fee. They accepted that their data was already stolen. And so I think some defenders, including at CyberCube, we assumed that CLOP would not do this again, that they would potentially shift their tactics and focus on a different type of SPOF or a different type of extortion scheme. That wasn't the case. In fact, they doubled down and they finally found an MFT SPOF that is deeply linked to a lot of organizations that were willing to pay in order to avoid their data being exposed. This is because they hit school districts, they hit healthcare facilities. They're relentless. And so the types of data that they're stealing, they know hold lots of leverage when it comes to getting people to pay. Even if some organizations don't think the threat actors will conceal the data, they might pay anyways, just on the off chance that it doesn't happen, because it's so devastating sometimes if it does get exposed. It doesn't sound like the best strategy, but I think that's taking place today. So in the future, we're now no longer saying CLOP is going to not hit managed file transfer tools, that we think this is probably a tried and true tactic for them now. So what we've done is we've gone into the Russell 3000 group of companies essentially and looked at all the different managed file transfer tools that those companies depend on and created a mapping of the potential targets that CLOP could hit in the future. So we're urging our clients to go through their portfolios and look for MFT tools that could potentially be targeted by CLOP. And so we're now taking the stance that this will happen again.
Great, and there's some really good questions here on MOVEit. In the interest of time, I will refer you to a report that we're going to be putting out shortly on MOVEit and some of the lessons that have been learned from that attack. That will be coming out in the next week or so do keep posted. But in the interest of time, moving on, I have something here on artificial intelligence. Are you seeing, or do you expect to see, an impact on the cyber claims environment due to the proliferation of artificial intelligence, more specifically systems like ChatGPT? So what do we think is going to happen with artificial intelligence and the impact on the insurance industry?
So I don't think we'll ever be able to directly tie claims to a rise in claims to a rise in the adoption of artificial intelligence technology. So I don't want to go so far as to say that there's a direct link there, but we do know that artificial intelligence is having an impact across the cybersecurity space today on both the defense and attacker sides. When it comes to the attacker side, we're primarily seeing large language models like ChatGPT supercharge threat actors' ability to socially engineer their targets, namely through phishing emails. Now, ChatGPT has safeguards in place to prevent the use of the tool for social engineering. My team has been able to route those safeguards very easily, and as a proof of concept, we got ChatGPT to write phishing emails, and then we were able to translate those emails into colloquial dialects. And that's really key. What has previously held threat actors back in this space is the ability to translate phishing emails into realistic colloquial dialects. And now they can do that very easily using ChatGPT. So they can make these emails even more sophisticated and more convincing. So that being said, phishing is already the #1 initial attack vector for most companies. And so this is just one more tool in those threat actors' toolbox to use phishing and social engineering for initial access. On the defense side, we're also seeing ChatGPT as well as other AI tools used, mainly just to curate, collect, and synthesize lots of unstructured data so that resource-strapped analysts and security operations centers can make sense of that data more easily. So although AI is having an impact on attackers and creating an environment where they have access to more sophisticated tools, it's doing the same thing on the defense side. So I'm not sure you can clearly say that it will have an impact one way or the other, but we do know that it's something worth monitoring.
And it definitely is something worth monitoring. If you do follow our LinkedIn profile of CyberCube, you might see that we actually posted a video today on artificial intelligence. That was an interview that I conducted with Ashwin Kashyap. He's the co-founder of CyberCube and the chief product officer. So please do go and see that. That's available on our LinkedIn profile, also available on our website. So please do refer to that. There is a lot of content that we produce, and that can be found on the resources tab of our website, www.cybercube.com. cybercube.com, which is cube.com. William, thank you so much for your time today. The summary of the key lessons learned from that report that I mentioned on the MOVEit attack will be published in the next week or so we will send it to you shortly. Do look out for that. It will also be available on our website too. A follow-up email was a recording of this webinar, and a copy of today's presentation deck will also be sent out shortly. If you would like to reach out to anyone in the team about services, products, or if you have any additional questions, please do email us, and our email is info@cybercube.com. For CyberCube, thank you very much for joining us today. I'm Yvette Essen.